Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Pacific Toks Season 2. In this podcast, I engage in active conversations with my guests to talk about global challenges through a Pacific perspective. Today, I'm sharing with you a conversation I had with Mamta Chand, a women's rights activist from Fiji. I've known Mamta since 2016 when we met at the East West Center in Hawaii for the Pacific Island Leadership Program. By the way, you'll hear us talk about this program during our talk. Since this time, I've been following Mamta's work and I've been amazed by her power, her strength, and her ability to never give up on what is right and on pushing for positive change. She has also been one of the many women who have helped me to continuously question my perspectives and to make sure that my ideas and views on women and women's rights are based not only on what I think, but on what is and what should be according to them. That's what I wanted to talk to her today and share it with you. So now, on to my conversation with Mamta. Mamta, Ora Na, welcome to the Pacific Talks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
Well, it's my very pleasure to have you on this podcast. So, first question to warm up a little bit. Can you tell us just about yourself? Who are you and what was your life path up until now?
This question is so simple, but it always caught me off guard and I start overthinking. So I try my best to answer it. Currently, I'm working for a local feminist organization here in Fiji, and I've
Mhm.
been involved in the women's movement for 19 years now. I started off as a volunteer, and now I've moved into programmatic work. Mostly, I engage or work with amazing, diverse young women leaders in Fiji in terms of um, taking programs such as a rights-based feminist leadership program.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So 19 years, that's quite a long journey. What started that? What made you so willing and passionate to work for women for that long?
Uh, well, after I had no goals in life. I took made some bad choices, took some unnecessary risks, and I was just sort of not committed to my studies, higher studies more so. And then I told my parents, I don't think so. I could commit to studies. I don't know, it was something to do with perhaps the decisions I made. And
Hmm.
then my mom was like, okay, if you're not wanting to study, and she always, I remember both my parents always told me that money, being economically independent, is very important for a girl. So they told me, look for a job. So one of my cousins, introduced me to one of the local women's movement, and I joined in as a volunteer. And well, that path has become who I am now, 19
Hmm.
years later and going on. That's what I breathe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
indeed. And time flies, definitely,
it
when
sure
you're passionate.
does. Hmm.
So we're recording this episode on the week of the International Women's Rights Day. So as an introduction and knowing how much you've been involved in that domain, what is your view on the situation of women's rights in the Pacific today? And would you say that it's better or worse than the rest of the world?
Well, research has said that Pacific records one of the highest rate of violence in the in the Pacific. I think
Mm,
if you look at the global average, we are twice than the global average, around 30%. So Pacific is at its highest. For Fiji, if I can speak, research has shown that around 64%, 64%, that's more than half, 50%,
mm,
64% of women have experienced some sort of like physical or sexual violence from their intimate partners. And I think globally, the statistics reach at 68%. So if
wow.
you do the math and you look at Fiji, in our population, it's 64%. but globally they're saying it's 68%, and definitely it would have increased. And to take into consideration that when we speak about statistics, when we talk about girls and women, any forms of violence, and we talk data, which is so important, these are the reported cases. So
Mm.
that's something we also have to consider when I'm saying 64% in Fiji. And I think if we look at the Pacific, perhaps if we look at 14 island countries or 15 independent countries, most of the Pacific island countries' stats in terms of violence against women is definitely above 50%.
Mm. And so,
So we are the ones.
when you say reported cases, that mean that
Mm.
those statistics are just like the part of the iceberg that we can see, right? That's the one out of the surface. So that means that could be even worse in terms of the reality of the situation.
Exactly, exactly. So I think it's really important when we talk about, violence against women in any context or even any data, the back of the mind, that is something I've learned over the years, reported. Wh- These are visible. And then we have to think of the invisible lived realities of, diverse girls and women in Fiji and the Pacific. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And so the work that you've done obviously is not an easy one, and you've seen probably a lot while working with the communities. But I'm pretty sure that you've seen
Hmm.
also amazing situations and people. So, what's the best lesson that you've learned from those people you've been working with who are actually not most of the time in position of leaderships or are victims of discriminations, violence, inequalities, and all that?
Yeah. We all come with our biasness and perceived notion about people, about communities, about intersectionalities and diversities. But what the feminist movement has taught me is you really have to listen when
Mm,
someone is speaking about their lived realities, because we all are different, we all have different stories to tell, different experiences. You really have to listen because they are the expertise of their own lived realities and challenges, as well as sometimes the solutions. And something that I learned in PILP in myself, and that has really stuck with me, and I've been sharing it since I returned, is learn, unlearn, relearn. That
mm,
has become like one of my, I don't know how can I say it, like a mantra. Like I absolutely love that. And with that perspective of engaging with young women in various communities, that is something always at the back of my head, that when young women and girls are sharing their stories, because yes, we are learning from them, at the same time we are unlearning the biasness, and we are relearning in terms of the rights based approach. So that's, I
mm.
think, really critical for the work that we are doing.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that also makes me think about the ed sector,
Hmm.
like development ed and all that, and which is always the criticism that we can hear about this sector, which is very top-down approach, telling
Hmm.
people this is what you need, this is what we're going to give you, instead of saying, well, actually, what do you need and where can we help? And studies have shown that when you do that and when you let people empower themselves, it works much better, right?
Exactly. And it's also the context. As you've said, context is very important because something in Fiji would be totally different lived reality for a young woman in Tahiti. So we cannot
Mm,
assume, especially for the Pacific Islands, that we are all the same. Our culture, our way of life is all different. Yes, women do experience multiple forms of violence, but then there's a trickle effect. What happens, you cannot just assume that like, let's say for example, perhaps somewhere someone say, oh, that woman is a victim survivor of violence, leave. We cannot say that to a woman. You don't know her lived
mm,
realities. So taking all this into consideration is so important, particularly also from the leaders who make decisions. And I think COVID perhaps was one of the examples of how decisions were made or how people perceived communities and their needs.
mm, indeed. And as you're talking about COVID, I wanted to focus on that and the impact of the pandemic. because a lot
Mm-hmm.
of research in mostly in major countries, but I'm guessing it's the same elsewhere, has shown that the pandemic has reinforced inequalities between men and women. For
Mm,
example, when one of them had to leave their jobs in order to take care of the kids during lockdown and stuff, many women had to make the choice, and it was not
mm.
necessarily their choice, it just happened to be like that. And that, I think, show how gender roles are still quite strictly defined throughout the world. So how would
Mm.
you say the pandemic has impacted the situation of women, especially in the Pacific?
Yeah, what you said is definitely on point. We had done some local research and stuff, particularly talking with girls, young women, and women. And one of the things that really came out was because school was closed, so students were schooling from home. It's
Mm,
it was a nightmare for so many girls and young women going back to gender roles. So they were expected to do all the gender roles at home, which is cooking, cleaning, washing, caring, care work, looking after the siblings or nieces, nephew, or grandparents, while at the same time they had to be committed to studying. And
mm,
some of the young women and girls were like, their study was not prioritized. It was gender roles that was prioritized, and they were overwhelmed. Lots of mental health issues arose from that because there wasn't any support. And even so one of the programs I ran virtually, I could sense that the young women would give their apologies, or they would not be able to come on even video or talk proper because people were around them and they would listen to what they were sharing in
mm,
terms of the leadership program. So gender roles was really, it just hit the roof. And and then obviously when you look at the boys, they had all the chance to do just relax. So that
mm,
also was really difficult. And for women with children, most of the pressure was also on them to manage the housework. And when they were laid off, there wasn't any paid employment. Where do they get the money from? And then they had to look after the children, do the gender roles, and to top it off, manage their studies. So when we talk about
mm,
women and gender roles, it's multiple, but I think it tripled. The impact was so severe that women had nowhere to turn. And research also showed that women were reaching out for counseling, and they would do, let's early hours of the morning when like people were asleep, so that they could
mm.
talk to someone. So all that everyday real realities of women and girls really, really got worse during the pandemic.
Yeah. And so obviously most of the decisions taken by governments were taken under the emergency and the urgency
Hmm.
to protect the population from COVID. So it's not about blaming, but do you think they could have made decision otherwise, or plan solutions, or think about like all those impacts, and maybe as a lesson for the next crisis that would probably happen in the years to come, what
Hmm.
should be considered when trying to protect the population, but not realizing that it could impact women and all the populations that tend to be the victims of all those situations? Like what could be done or what could be thought about prior to make the decision?
Yeah, it was an interesting phase because I started reflecting of the types of leadership styles that
Mm-hmm.
we learned into the program. And I was like, okay, some of the decisions that were made, it was needed, like curfew and all those things, because people were moving, people were not believing in COVID and all those things that we know. People were just misinformed and uninformed. Yes, with lessons learned. So when we talk about policies needs to be put into place from the lessons learned for the 2 years now. This is our third year, in
Mm,
terms of how the decisions were made, why the decisions were made, what were the impacts, and what are the lessons learned. I think that's really important. And but I for me personally, I kept thinking is things were was just so beyond our control. I think it was in February when I was out of the country and I heard about COVID, and I did not really concentrated on that. And then I realized, wow, that was my mistake because it wasn't happening in Fiji. It did not trickle
Mm.
into Fiji, in the Pacific. But the way it just exploded, and I was like, did the leaders who are, who are there to serve and protect our country, did they take this on board and say, okay, hey, this is happening in a particular part of the country? What are the impacts? What if it happens in Fiji? What's the emergency plan? Just like our lessons learned from cyclone and
Mm.
whatnot. So yeah, so hopefully good decisions will be made, but still, I
Mm.
think when it comes to leadership, it's also about power,
Yeah.
and then power, the push and the shove, who makes the decision, who's in the limelight, who's
Mm.
correct, who's not correct. And we could see that some of the leaders who were quite practical, who were quite logical because they had the expertise, but other leaders who necessarily did not have the expertise or were logical, but they felt they need to show their power, that authority, they made wrong choices and wrong decisions. And the people, the citizens, the community who were more vulnerable were affected.
Mm.
Yeah. So I think it all comes back
Indeed.
to power and the choices and decisions that the leaders make.
Mm. And potentially also being able to learn from the experience of others and anticipate as much as you can from that.
That's the hope. Lessons learned.
Mm. Indeed. I'd like to come back to another element you were mentioning a little bit earlier, which is I think very important we do the conversation around women and their role in society. You said like when we do this conversation, when we have this conversation on women, it's obviously different in Fiji as it's in Tahiti or in other continents or countries. Uh,
Mm,
but we see that also used like this cultural difference or this cultural specificity is sometimes used by some people to justify the gender inequality or the gender difference. Like, oh yeah, but this is our culture. We do differently than, and this is a conversation that is imported or whatnot. So through your work and your experience in that, how do you address these arguments and how do you engage in conversations to help people reflect on this topic and
mm.
like have the perspective between cultural preservation and social progress?
Yeah, culture. When we talk about culture, it's so deeply rooted in the Pacific, that it also becomes dangerous when we talk about social progress, when we talk about gender inequality. As I've said, I mostly engage with young women, so
Mm.
it's pretty. I would is not easy. It's pretty practical when we draft the program and engage with young women in terms of talking about gender inequality and culture. How does that affect equality? I think it's important. So one of the lessons learned I've not to jump into it, not to jump into conversation and say, okay, this is happening because of this. It's slowly unfolding the conversations. It's asking the young women, it's what is your lived reality? What basically we do gender 101. What
Mm.
do you understand by gender? That goes back to men, boys and girls, men and women, and the roles of boys and girls, men and women, how society perceives them. What were you expected to do at home because you are a girl? What about the boy child? What is that child expected to do? What were some of your, it's everyday conversations? For example, were you allowed to go out at night? No. Why not? Was the boy allowed to go out at night? Yes. Why? So those everyday lived reality, to project it, to visibilize it, and then unpack it. Why is that happening? And linking it to the inequalities. Why are those inequalities? Because perhaps it is said, The elders in the family are saying boys should behave like this, girls should behave like this. Okay, why are they saying that? Perhaps it's part of the scriptures. Who wrote the scriptures? Why are they saying that? Slowly unpacking all those, and then it
Mm.
comes back to the conversations of power and control. Because when we talk about patriarchy, when we talk about violence against women, when we talk about oppression, it all comes back to power. It all comes back to, and who has the power in the society. When we talk patriarchy, we talk men. Okay, man has the holds the power in your home. Who holds the power? It's the dad, the granddad, the older brothers, even if they're younger brothers, they hold the power. So with that comes the conversation of unpacking that power, because it's always about controlling women's and girls' bodies, controlling the decisions, controlling the choices. So because culture, when we talk about culture, it is a very sensitive topic for some of the people, and we cannot go in or come in with that, you know. I go in fighting. I love doing that, but
Mm,
that's what
mm,
I've unlearned. That because you are challenging something they have been conditioned since birth, since X
mm,
number of years, and to unlearn that, it takes time. It can be a shocker. One of the examples I will use when we talk about, culture and how do we try to maneuver that conversations when we talk about gender equality is, in the program, I like to talk about pro-choice or access to safe abortion.
mhm,
And I have seen that in my own networks. It the conversation, like, girls end up crying because we are like, oh my god, when I mean the debate on abortion, it's at another level. So I'm like, okay, it's if your faith, your culture, your religion, your choice is not to have an abortion, it's okay. That's your choice. But you don't have the right to deny me that choice, because it's
mm,
my body. I'm making the decision. So it's and you can see the light bulb going in them, because you
mm,
have talked about we all are different. Young women come with their own multiple identities, with their own challenges. We are not the same, so you cannot deny anyone their basic access to human rights. So I think it's very critical. Something I've learned in this field is unpacking stories, unpacking realities, and pushing that rights based approach, in terms of, okay, what is right, what is wrong. And I always love to throw it back to the participant. So, what will you
mhm.
do? What do you think now? Yeah.
Interesting. But I guess what makes it even harder in the Pacific is to disentangle also the different cultural layers, because you have the traditional culture, you have the colonizer culture that came
Yes.
and influenced, and the religious culture that is another element, and making people navigate to understand, okay, is this really your culture or not your culture, or how it had become and how it can evolve, and all those conversations must be like another level of difficulty.
Yeah, because challenging something that we had conditioned to can be, it can be dangerous, and well as a shocker. And one thing is that, like, when we talk about culture, some of the, maybe one of some of the Pacific Island countries, haven't even ratified CEDAW. We talk about,
Mm,
Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and also how it is interpreted, like the culture or the scriptures or the text that, I mean, for me, I follow Hinduism. I was born into a Hindu family, and I don't know much about it, just 0.01% perhaps. But it does, from what I understand, is it does talk about equality, that, men and women are equal. And, one of our supreme goddesses is even defined as both being, masculine and femininity. So I think that's so
mm,
beautiful. But then the way over the years, and also, yes, colonization has interpreted it, it has just given power to men. Men,
that's true.
I think men perhaps never had that power, but how it got trickled, they took that power. So I'm always like, it's okay to challenge, it's okay to ask, there's no harm. But then the issue is, as a girl child or boy child, again, culturally, you're not supposed to talk back to the elders or ask elders the questions, or just be curious. I think we should teach girls and boys to be curious and ask
Mm.
questions. And something that I never had. I did ask questions. Maybe I was given weird answers, but looking back, I'm like able to unpack it myself.
Mm.
Culture really, really, I think, is so significant in being able to dismantle the conditioning or to learn about gender equality. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And on that note, I'd like to have your view on something. So, as I said earlier, we're recording this episode on the week of International Women's Rights Day. And
Mm,
it happens that here in Tahiti, we have many events organized to quote unquote celebrate women during those days. And unfortunately, from my perspective, those
mm-hmm,
events are mostly focusing on well-being, on makeup, on clothing, on jewelry, all those elements. And
mm,
I don't see many conversation on domestic violence, women's representation, or even highlighting women entrepreneurs and so on.
mm,
From my position, I've always reacted to that. But I'd like to have your view on this because you know the topic much better than I do. And I'm feeling that maybe I'm biased or I have like a distorted view on that. So can those kind of initiatives have a
mm.
benefit for women, or is it somehow not that bad as it seems to me? What do you think?
Okay, yeah, because I read that, like, well-being, makeup, clothing, and jewelry. I think that is great, because when we talk about women in business, most of the women, some women in business, they are part of this uh what's that thing called, community or society, because, and it's
Mm-hmm.
about financial independence, so that's okay, that's amazing. But at the same time, yes, we do need to have conversations on domestic violence, women's representation, and something in Fiji, like how you've pointed out in Tahiti on well-being, makeup, clothing, or jewelry. In Fiji is something that I get annoyed with, and some of my other friends, is cake cutting. We have cakes and cupcakes, or morning tea for women. And who will prepare those morning tea? It's the women who are preparing those morning tea. So at the same time, when we're saying, yes, we need to celebrate, but at the same time, it's commemorating how many X number of years. As I've said, women come with multiple identities, multiple diversities. Something I've learned again. For a woman, perhaps International Women's Day for her means as a businesswoman is to go out, have a booth, and sell her jewelries. Someone to do Zumba. But for others, it's more important to talk about, multiple forms of violence. It's important to talk about mental health. So that is also important, because women know their lived realities and they know what they want. Yeah. But I know where you're coming from.
Mm. But also, okay, so if I sum up what you're saying, it's very much the intention. So if it's done as a way to show what women can do, or just to tell women you can just like enjoy yourself and like be who you want to be, and like all those elements,
Mm,
then eventually that sends like a good message. But if it's only to perpetuate basically gender roles and say, oh, women are
mm,
only interested
mm,
in makeup and stuff, then
mm.
obviously that's when it's becoming debatable. But celebrating women must not definitely be, and I definitely agree on that, on just like focusing on the bad things or the bad situation that is currently going on.
Yeah, if we're talking about, let's say you are inviting a woman in business who's doing jewelries, and that's something. I mean, women in the Pacific are so amazing with, it's
Mm,
art with that, and you are inviting that particular woman. Let's say she has a booth, she's selling it, people are buying it, she's making money out of it. At the same time, what are the incentives set by the leaders or the government or the policy makers to provide more access, resources to that woman? Or is she be able to share, her experience, why is she doing that, how is she doing that? Perhaps that's the only way for her to be able to make money, because she has that expertise. So all this is very important to take into consideration why a woman chooses a particular path. Yeah.
okay, let's see. Now I get it clearly. Okay, thanks, Mamta. Another element that is also sometimes hard to navigate with is social media. We are
Hmm.
obviously in an age of persistent communication, and in many ways, social medias have been an agent of empowerment for some communities and minority groups, including women. But we also have seen how these platforms have been used to bully, to harass, to perpetuate many negative things. So in your work, how do you use social media as an efficient tool or a positive tool to help women and avoid them being used as a tool of oppression, pretty much?
Yeah. Um. It's interesting when we talk about access to technology and internet, because when I talk with young women now, it's like my age, I sound so old. It's like I did not really have, I mean, because we're not that smartphones and stuff is so limited. So we had to, if there was a particular word I did not understand in the feminist world, I would look up in the dictionary. But for now, there are so many privileged people or young women who have access to technology, data, and internet, and who can just type a particular word and find out so many amazing things about that. For our work, I think it's social media is so important. When we do research, um, we put it online. And yes, we have to take consideration also, not everyone has access to technology or internet, but it is important how, and we just not reach locally or nationally, it's to the Pacific, and globally we are able to share the lived realities of young women and girls in Fiji, share the data, the statistics, share what is happening, and also at the same time uh, learn from others. So it is really important. But yes, at the same time, um, in from my personal experience and some of my many friends, the bullying and harassment is really really toxic, because social media also can become toxic, and some of the young women, it does have a very negative impact on them. And I'm like, the keyboard warriors, it also goes back to how common sense. I think common sense is just dead. Humans, like, use your common sense in how are you
Mhm.
accessing a particular resources, how are you putting out information. That
Yeah,
I think is
that
very important.
yeah, definitely, and that's interesting because as I listen to you, I'm realizing that the challenge of your work is to help people navigate into the subtlety of any situation. It's never black or white. Like there's
No.
nothing binary, and walking towards more inclusivity really goes towards opening people to the fact that any situation is a spectrum of options or possibilities, and we have to be very careful and mindful in however we decide to react to any situation. So it's
Mhm.
challenging, but it's also fascinating because it can eventually lead to more critical thinking and to more maybe common sense, as you just said.
Definitely. And when we talk about, communication or technology or even social media, COVID, I mean, for the first time, that one of the programs I ran in the her story of FWRM with 35 years now, like, we went virtual. That program
Mm,
had to be virtual, and it was challenging because face to face session is something different from being virtual. But at the same time, lots of lessons learned, and we made sure that we're in constant touch with our young women, with the participants, because we cannot isolate the people we engage with during the crisis. And COVID was a crisis which showed people become disengaged. It had so much trauma, and social
mm,
media was also another way to sort of come and connect, support each other. If someone did not have food, they would reach out. We had a barter system. So goes back to common sense and how individuals are taking that positive step to access social media and to help and support each other, rather than just becoming toxic and bullying one another. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, indeed. And that ties perfectly to my next question, which comes at the moment of the podcast where I share with my guest a quote from a book that I read recently to try of making a like a indirect conversation between my guest and the writer. And for you, I chose a quote from the recent book from Roger Bergman, the historian. born in the Netherlands, who wrote this book,
Mhm.
Humankind. And he talks to us about the dark side of empathy. And this is what he says in his book. One thing is certain: a better world doesn't start with more empathy. If anything, empathy makes us less forgiving because the more we identify with victims, the more we generalize about our enemies. The bright spotlight we shine on a chosen few makes us blind to the perspective of our adversaries because everybody else falls outside our view. The sad truth is that empathy and xenophobia go hand in hand. There are two sides of the same coin. I'd like to have your view on this quote, and especially to relate it to what you know about the situation of women in the region.
Yeah, when I read this, I read this a couple of times. I was like, okay, what are you trying to say? One thing that really got to me, I was like, okay, interesting. The men chose humankind instead of mankind. So that was
Mhm.
interesting. Yeah, so I was trying to just pick out certain words or sentences that spoke to me. So one thing is because the more we identify with victims, the more we generalize about our enemies. So when I look at this in terms of, women's human rights, women are victims and survivors of multiple forms of violence, and the enemy is, I would say, patriarchy, the system,
Mm.
the power.
Mhm.
And when we talk about empathy, the work we do in terms of women's human rights, empathy is important. Empathy is needed because if there's no empathy, no compassion, you are unable to understand someone's lived reality.
Mm.
And I assume that he talked, perhaps this is linked to COVID, because I read xenophobia, so I was like, okay, maybe this was linked to COVID and all
That
the
was prior to it, but I guess it
prior
applies
to
also to COVID as well.
yeah, I mean, and Islamophobia and whatnot is going
Mm.
on.
Yeah,
But when
definitely.
when I was trying to link it to women's human rights in the region, empathy is really important. Otherwise, you are not able to do justice to the passion, and you just become clinical. And in this
Mm.
type of, but then on the hindsight, something I've learned, it's sometimes okay to disassociate yourself, because it really can mentally mess you up, and it can really impact you. So for me, that was like, okay, what are you trying to tell me? And that's how for me, empathy is important in the work I do. And but
Mm.
I'd be really interested to know what exactly he's talking about.
Yeah, I guess the question he asked, or the point he's trying to make, and that relates to another research from the evolutionary scientist Brian Hoare on empathy, where very much he says it's good to have empathy. Obviously, it's helpful because it helps us to connect to the people we're working with. But the question is, should we also have empathy for those on the other side of the situation?
Mm, mm,
The people who have bullied, the people who have discriminated, the people who have perpetuated the system. Because eventually, the conclusion being, if you empathize only to the victims, then you grow angry against those people who made them victims. And that's where you create division in our societies and
mm.
pointing fingers instead of saying, like, let's try to rebuild something together and be more maybe invitational in the attitude.
Yeah, so yeah, that's exactly how I perceived it. So my thing was that, like, when we talk about a convicted rapist,
Mm,
for now it's one of the biggest topic in our country is one of the convicted rapists, a rugby player, is out there playing rugby on the field. And I'm like, so in terms of empathy, so it's like, okay, you're showing that convicted rapist empathy, you're providing him with all this access to resources, he's become a national star, he's playing rugby. What is happening to the survivor? So when it
mm.
comes to that situation, for me personally, I'm like, no, I will
Yeah, it's
not show
obviously
empathy.
difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, to a perpetrator. Yeah. So, but that was really interesting because it makes you think, and I think this was a good quote. Yeah.
Mm. And it makes me think of so the work that a local therapist is doing here in Tahiti, and she's
Hmm.
working with domestic violence victims and perpetrators, and she's created this a group where they can talk to each other, and she's trying
Mm.
to like make them understand the perspective of each other. And I guess that's where empathy can become very powerful, is to ask each side to say, okay, put yourself in the shoes of the other, and try to re-understand what happened here
Mm.
and why this person like is angry or feel like being victimized, because sometimes even the perpetrator doesn't even realize that the person in front is a victim,
Mm.
because like, yeah, that's just normal for me, right?
Yeah, goes back to the conversation in terms of power, gender
Mm,
inequality, patriarchy, and the entitlement of men. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, definitely. All right, well, my last question for you, Manta, this I guess this is a conversation that could go on for hours, but uh, so there's still a lot to do, obviously, in terms of improving the situation of women in the region and globally, and to work together as towards more inclusivity and more equalities. So, for whoever is listening to you right now and to this episode, and who's willing to become an agent of change for his or her community, uh,
Mm.
but could feel helpless because it feels like there's so many
Yeah,
things to be done
yeah.
yet. What would be your advice? What would you like to share to those people, and how would you encourage them to walk in your steps?
Wow, this question actually took me back 19 years. When
Mm,
I was like, innocent, young, excited to be stepped into the world of feminism or women's human rights. You go in with so much passion, so much awe in terms of to learn, to create positive change, to challenge inequalities. It does break you. It because for me, like, I have high expectations of things, and if things don't go a certain way, I'm like, it is not like that. So one important thing is, it's okay to take a step back and rethink,
mm,
and it's okay if things sometimes don't go your way. But the trick is that, how are you maneuvering yourself, or how are you, in a positive, healthy way, managing that? And another thing is that, stop, in terms of the work I do, or if you want to be an agent of change, it's stop looking at the world through a heteronormative lens, or take off your biased lens, uh, take off your conditioning, and basically it's learn, unlearn, relearn. I
mm,
think that's really important. But that really got to me, helpless for now. I think of so many, when we talk about violence against women, it's an ongoing issue for ages and ages. Yes, we have had progression in Fiji and the Pacific. We cannot deny that, or else today we won't be having this conversation. But at the same time, so many things has been happening that a person does feel helpless. And for me personally, I'm like, it's okay if I feel not good about myself, or not good about the situation, or I'm just angry at the world, I have this rage. It's okay to feel all that, because we are told not to feel angry or the rage or be helpless. But and importantly, find that support system who will be able to be there with you, beside you, and just tell you, hey, it's okay if you're having a bad day.
mm,
we'll we will move forward, and we will, if you have that commitment and that passion, you will create that change. And don't put pressure on self. That's another important thing. Don't put pressure on self and feel like you are gonna solve each and every world problem, because unfortunately it doesn't happen. Even superheroes cannot do that. Yeah.
mm. That's true. And I was remembering while you were talking about something you told me a few years back, that you
Hmm.
prefer to go with false hope than being hopeless.
Yeah, I think because that would that's a step forward. That one step
Mm,
is important. Even it's a small step, it's a tiny step, it's fine. So, and I think all of us, we have high expectations of self and the world, but learn to be disappointed. Yeah. Oh gosh, I'm not trying to sound negative, but that's the reality that I have experienced. That not everything is unfortunately rainbows and unicorns. Even
Mm,
in the movement that we work with, it's so many challenges, but it's just trying to maneuver and celebrate the little achievements, celebrate the achievements, put that up first, and say, okay, this is the challenge I'm going to tackle next.
yeah. And I guess
Yes.
if we remain curious and keep asking questions, as you said at the very beginning
Mm.
of this episode, that's still like the fuel that we need to move forward and to still find ways to continue and to still find inspiration also in
Oh,
whatever is happening.
definitely. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yep.
Mamta, thank you very much for your time and this amazing conversation. And all the best for all your projects and endeavors. And thank you for all the good work you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and being able to share some of the stuff that I've learned and continue to learn over the years. Thank you.
Pacific Talks is a podcast hosted by me, Philippe, and produced by Pacific Venture Media. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to subscribe to any podcast platform of your choice. You can also share it on your social medias or with your friends, family, or colleagues. And if you listen to it on a podcast platform, feel free to leave us a review. This is very important to us as it helps us to reach out to more people. If you want to share your thoughts and ideas following this conversation with Alexander, you can reach out to us directly by email contact@pacificventure.com or on all our social platforms. Until next time, with another guest, another discussion on the challenges of the Pacific. Take care and see you soon.